Hello and welcome back to The Mariner. Thanks very much for all the new subscriptions, new people joining the channel. That's fantastic. And a lot of new people over on Patreon. Thank you very much for that. I'm excited to be able to share with you today another Mariner's Library episode, which is where I get some footage from a voyage I've done. This one's from Iceland to Newfoundland in September, a difficult time to be on the Atlantic, on the 80-foot boat Osprey, a Gran Mistral Maxi. We've taken that footage and I've mated it to one of the more interesting chapters of a book I recently read as an audiobook. It's from the title Southseaman by Weston Martyr. This chapter is looking at his ideas on navigation. It's about 1923 when he's writing this, and he's a very comedy-filled writer. It's tongue-in-cheek, but I think there's something there to learn. So learn from the audiobook if you can. Watch the footage if that's interesting. Turn off the audiobook and put your own music on, whatever you want to do. If you want to hear more of the book, go to the Mariner's Library podcast, which is available on Apple Podcasts. If you want to learn more about the sailing, go to patreon.com/The Mariner. And there weekly on the Friday, I'll do a live stream, which the higher tiers can access. And just after that's finished, the completed video of commentary of this footage of what's going on, what's happening, what we learned, what we did. All of that will be available for subscribers on Patreon. So thank you very much for new Patreon subscribers. Thank you very much for new YouTube membership subscribers. And here is another episode of The Mariner's Library. Hello and welcome to the Mariner's Library with me, Chris Stanmore Major. And in this episode we're continuing the book The Southseaman by Weston Martyr. We're beginning chapter 21 and this is the 21st part of the reading. The Mariner's Library is supported by Edward William Marine Insurance. If you're looking for a new policy on your boat or to upgrade the policy that you already have, check out edwardwilliam.com and get a free quote. And if you follow the link in the podcast description or use the code MARINER10 at checkout, you get an exclusive 10% discount deal and help support the production of the Mariner's Library. Now on with the story. Chapter 21. The fine and windless weather that had prevailed for days before we sailed from Shelburne broke up in the squall which so nearly murdered our ship. That short, fierce blast from the east struck at us passionately and passed, sweeping away the curtain of high clouds and revealing a sky hard, steely, and glittering with glaring, polished stars. The dawn broke high in a wicked flare of copper and evil green, and a fresh wind, steady, cold, and keen as a knife, swept across the waters, racing westward with the light. The schooner, heeling to the wind with hardened, straining sails and creaking sheets, fled to the southward, a frothing wave at her bows and her lee rail awash, and a white wake streaming astern of her. Throughout the morning watch, the wind held true and steady, while the Southseaman under her 3 lower sails reached past the land. At 6 a.m. we streamed the log, and to test it took careful bearings of the shore. At 9 a.m. Cape Sable was abeam, and we had run 26 miles over the ground, and the log showed 28.2, but the tide was against us, so it seemed that the log must be nearly correct. Said George, completing some figuring. I thought she was slippery, coming down the bay in that light air, but unless these figures lie, she's been doing 9.4 knots these last 3 hours. It's too good almost, and there must be something wrong, but whatever's happening, there's one thing certain. The Southseaman's fast. We took our departure from Cape Sable and steered south, true, until in a little while the land faded astern of us and vanished, and at last we were alone in our little untried ship. And when George came upon deck at noon to take an observation, there was nothing in sight at all but sea and sky. Which, being the case, I think this is a good place to tell you about our methods of navigation. 9 days before we sailed from Shelburne, neither George nor I could have found our position by an astronomical observation, if our very lives had depended on it. And now that we were out of sight of land, and our lives did more or less depend upon our knowledge of nautical astronomy, I personally could not have recognised the first point of Aries from a hole in the ground. But George could, or said he could. George had taken 8 short and hectic lessons in navigation from old Captain Jennings, and he was now the proud owner of an old sextant, a chronometer watch, older still, and a collection of tables, textbooks, and almanacs, through which he could not as yet find his way, but which he hoped to master before we made our next landfall. I hope so too. Judging from what I've just written, it might appear that George and I were looking for trouble, with every prospect of finding it. Knowing next to nothing about scientific navigation, we were setting out on a long voyage with the certainty before us of having to make some very difficult landfalls. However, we did know a thing or two, and we had a very clear idea of what we were up against, so that we were not really a couple of such innocent and unsophisticated babes in the wood as might appear. For one thing, George, who once upon a time had been a banker, was a great hand at figures, and he was confident that, with study, practice, and luck, he could be able to find the reefs off Bermuda before they found us. And if George failed, then that was where I came in. But this will not do. I see that my particular brand of navigation requires a paragraph or two to itself. There are 2 methods of finding a ship's position on the face of the waters. 1, by scientific calculation, and 2, by empirical guess. And though no scientist or certificated navigator will ever admit it, there are points about number 2 which mark it as superior in many respects to number 1, and which seem to indicate that the empirical guessing scheme is the one for the small boat sailorman to follow if he wishes to find his way in safety across the seas. This opinion of mine will no doubt be greeted with scorn and derision, and in fact it has already been so greeted many a time. But in spite of all this, contumely my opinion still persists, and I intend to continue to navigate by the method which suits me, and which has always served me well. And besides, I never could get a sum right. Once, during those dreadful years when I was a slave to a downtown New York broker, I went in for a course of navigation. It was a course run by a correspondence school that advertised extensively and fiercely. I had mighty little free time of my own in those days, and what spare moments I did have were drear and a mockery, because there were not enough of them to allow me to get to the waterside and see a ship, much less to set foot aboard one. The very thought of a correspondence school fills me with horror, but so bored was I with my life in those days that I actually entered for that loudly boomed navigation course. You see, that seemed to be the one and only way in which I could get in touch again with the sea and a little of the life I loved. That was a touch, very faint and remote to be sure, and scarcely felt at all, but it was a touch, and it helped. I took that course seriously, I can tell you. It turned out to be an extremely good and thorough one in spite of those flamboyant advertisements, and I worked hard at it. I used to fancy myself greatly as a seaman in those days, and I actually believed there was very little about seamanship anybody could tell me. And after 5 weeks of my course, I began to see myself a navigator as well. Before that time, I had always carried about with me a secret shame. I could splice wire and sail a ship to windward, but I could not shoot the sun nor work out a sight. Another few weeks of this course, said I to myself, and I'll be able to look the Astronomer Royal in the eye without blushing. I was a proud man, I assure you. Then along came the next week's lesson, and it was all about spherical triangles. Before I read that lesson, I had no idea there was such things in the world as spherical triangles, and when I had read my lesson once, I still could not see how a triangle could be spherical anyway. However, I was determined to be a navigator, so I gripped my head in my hands and concentrated on that lesson again. I read it all thoroughly and carefully, and it did not mean anything. I read it again, and it meant less. I studied it sternly and with anguish a 4th time, and the thing was sheer nonsense. So I went to bed. The next night I had another go at it. I drank strong coffee, I wrapped my head in a towel and read the thing out, slowly and aloud, and it still meant nothing to me.
I read it again, and I sweated and scratched my head and groaned, but all without effect. For 5 nights on end I strove to get to the bottom of those perishing triangles, and I attacked the lesson desperately at intervals for a further 2 weeks. But it was no use. The spherical triangles completely defeated me, and they still do. I gave up. I gave up my course. I gave up the spherical triangles. I gave up the hope of ever being a scientific navigator. However, I was not, after all, very much cast down by that business. I thought of all those old-time sailors who explored the seas of this world, most unscientifically, but most successfully. These old gentlemen sailed about the oceans with no instrument except a compass to guide them, but all the same they seemed to have managed very well. I thought of my old skipper, Captain Bloody Webb, who sailed his schooner safely for years and years all over the North and South Pacific, with nothing but a battered old quadrant which he never used, and a locked mahogany chronometer case in which he kept the ship's money. He may have kept a chronometer there too, but he certainly never wound it. I thought too of those Banks schooner skippers who sometimes never see the land for 6 months on end, but who navigate from spot to spot with precision, by instinct, I think, and their sense of smell. I remembered also some voyages of my own, a 700-mile passage, for instance, through 10 days of gale and calm, headwinds and fog, when, navigating by the empirical guessing system, I made my desired landfall dead ahead. This may have been luck, and the successful termination of some other long passages may have been luck too, but I do not think so. I think I must just be a natural-born empirical guesser. These thoughts comforted me, and there were also some other consoling reflections which passed through my mind. It sounds all very wonderful and grand to be able to calculate your position by observations of the celestial bodies, but this is, after all, merely a matter of arithmetic according to rule. Thus it is necessarily simple to read the rules and your instruments work out a sum or two, and there you are. Sometimes any ass with sense enough to dodge the study of spherical triangles could do it. But the trouble with the system is that when you really need to know your ship's position most exactly, the scientific method will not work. Let the celestial bodies withdraw themselves demurely behind a veil of cloud, and the scientific navigator is immediately ruined. It is no fun being a scientific navigator, running, for instance, under an obscured sky before a gale of wind to a port situated somewhere ahead upon a perilous lee shore. At a time like that, a ship is fortunate if there be an empirical guesser aboard, for he will be the man to guide her safely into harbour. The blotting out of the sun or a moon or two, or all the stars, cannot prevent a master of that fine art known as dead reckoning from fixing the position of his ship. Anyone can learn to shoot the sun, but to be able at any time to put a finger on the chart and say with confidence, "We are here," one must first be a seaman of long experience, skilled in the art of guessing right, with a power of reasoning out the effect of all the forces of wind and tide and sea, and of a sense within one that is akin to the instinct of the homing bird. This is a fine art, as I said before. The reluctance of the heavenly bodies to parade themselves before the eyes of the scientific navigator whenever he wishes to take a shot at them is a fact which tends to make the work of that gentleman ineffective. And if he be navigating a small sailing vessel, there are other adverse factors which arise and render most of his scientific labours ineffectual as well. Owing to the lowness of the vessel in the water and her antics upon it, the SN will find it always difficult and often impossible to take an accurate observation of the heavenly bodies, even though they blaze high above him out of a cloudless sky. His sextant thus becomes a scouting and a mockery, and that other prop on which he leans invariably gives way and lets him heavily down, which is to say his chronometer changes its rate. A small craft in a big sea is no place for a piece of very delicate mechanism, and I have never met a chronometer yet that was not well aware of this fact and ready and willing to make it an excuse for failing in its duty. So much for science aboard small boats at sea. It is for the above reasons, and not by any means because of those blighted spherical triangles, that I can proudly proclaim myself a disciple of the empirical guessing school. A few minutes after noon on our first day at sea, George retired to the chart room with his sextant and an air of importance. At 3 bells he emerged with 3 sheets of figures and a worried look. "What do you make her position at noon, Jay?" said he. 26 miles south, a quarter east of Cape Sable." My working seems to be a little out somewhere." "Where do you make her, George?" "Well, it's queer, but it must be right, for I've gone over the thing 3 times, and I had a good sight too. I make it 110 degrees 35 minutes west, 38 degrees 24 minutes north." "Well, good for you, George. Where does that put her?" "That's the queer thing, Jay, and I can't make it out. 110 west and 38 north lands her plumb in the middle of Utah." "Gee whizzles! Ooh, she's been moving since 9 a.m. You think you're navigating an aeroplane, George? Are you sure of your figures?" Yes, I'm absolutely certain." "Well, then either the sun's gone mad or you need a lot more practice. I vote we go by my dead reckoning." And we did. All day the wind from the east blew steady and strong, and so we kept the schooner sailing, working her watch and welcoming the chance to make her southing. As the sun went down, the wind died with the light, and when I came on deck again to stand the middle watch, the Southseaman was running quietly along before a warm and gentle breeze out of the nor'west. It was a very perfect night, clear, serene, and peaceful, and as I sat on the wheel box steering a ship which seemed to need no steering, I began to think about things and to understand fully what a fortunate fellow I was to be sailing there. Affected, I suppose, by the great peace and wonder of that glorious night, I remember falling at length into a state of quiet exultation, and I began to think aloud to myself. A fair wind and a fine night, thought I, and here am I on deck, alone, with my own ship under me, running to the southward, running down the clean and salty seas, running fast and smoothly from the land, and leaving all the muck of life that's there behind me. This is my dream that has at last come true, and it's better than I dreamed. The wheel trembled a little under my hand, and I trembled too, for my thoughts thrilled me. It is dark, thought I, but the stars are bright, and I can see the black shadow of my boat sliding through that other gentle heaving blackness which is the sea, while across the background of the sky the pointed sails swing gently, the very motioning of peace. As the ship glides through the waters, she makes a little whispering hiss. "Hush, hush, hush," she murmurs. But this request the reef points do not heed, and they go on pattering like little wilful fairies dancing on the sails. The wind tonight works silently and pushes us along as fast as you would walk on springy turf, say, with joy in your heart. And the sea smell, that aroma as of some clean spice, pricks my nose, and I fill myself with long, deep breaths of it. Short days ago I lived in an unclean city and choked with thrice-breathed breath. But now I sail on the vasty deep, and I breathe the northwest wind. It is good, it is very good to be at sea, when the waters have cleaned the stain of land from the horizon, when the waves have climbed aboard and washed the decks, and the spray has whitened the rigging, when you've settled down to the sea routine of watching and working and watching again, and dreamless sleeping. Then, and only then, and if you are worthy, peace comes softly down and folds her wings about you. Well, that's all for today. I hope you're enjoying the story so far. The next instalment will be available in the Mariner's Library shortly. And remember, of course, you've got all the content over on YouTube and the Mariner podcast, and of course Patreon at patreon.com/The Mariner. But for now, wherever you are and whatever you're doing, I hope that you are safe and sound, and I look forward to speaking to you in the next one. Cheers. Okay, now if you've got to the end of this video and you're enjoying this content, please consider going over to
patreon.com/The Mariner, and there you can see the commentary version of this video. It won't have the audio book. It's going to have the sounds from the background of what's going on, and it's going to have me sort of inset doing a version of a commentary on this. It's going to have me inset off to one corner, stopping and chatting through everything. The last time we did one of these, a 20-minute episode, was an hour-long live stream. If you're a higher tier member on Patreon, then you can go and listen to it as a live stream and interact with me live. And if you're one of the lower levels on Patreon, then you can watch it as soon as it's finished. Same for membership on YouTube. So if you want to get more from this, that's how you do it. You can either go and listen to the audiobook in its entirety, which is a really great book, over on Apple Podcasts, The Mariner's Library, or if you want to go to patreon.com/The Mariner, you can see the commentary version of this. Now, we've got opportunities coming up in 2025, 2026 to go sailing on this boat with me. Full crew. We'll be doing the Fastnet race, the Middle Sea race, and the Newport Bermuda race. If that seems of interest to you, email me at csmthemariner@gmail.com and we can chat. I'm getting a really nice group of people together who are excited about sailing, who are excited about learning, and are passionate about their sailing, and we're going to go have a lot of fun doing those in 2025, 2026. So email me, let's connect, and there's 20 spots on each race only. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this and look forward to speaking to you on Friday, which is when we'll come back to Preventers, and I'm going to explain exactly what this is and how this happened and how you can avoid it. Cheers.